Each of today's readings deals in their own ways with the theme of mutual fidelity between God and God's people. In the first reading, the leaders of the 12 tribes of Israel make a choice to be faithful to the Lord as they remember God's liberating power and faithfulness to them. The psalmist proclaims glory for the Lord who rescues and watches over the bones of the just, saves the brokenhearted, and destroys evildoers. Even the second reading presents a vision of a kind of mutual fidelity. Brothers and sisters, be subordinate to one another out of reverence for Christ. In the gospel, while many desert Jesus, finding his teachings too hard, too bizarre, the disciples stay by Jesus' side, sensing his faithfulness to them as they declare, "You have the words of eternal life." I recently had the chance to reflect on my own experience of God's faithfulness during an 8-day silent retreat. Our retreat leader led us in an opening guided meditation, so let's go there now. Close your eyes and imagine that you are in the midst of a bustling crowd on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. And of all the many people gathered there, Jesus locks eyes with you, walks straight up to you and asks, "What is it that you ask of me?" So what do you tell him? What is it that you ask of Jesus? For my own part, I was caught off guard by what welled up inside of me in response to Jesus' question. As he gazed on me with eyes of love, his hand outstretched, what I felt was a flash of anger. And the words that rose up in me were, "I want you to be my ally." In the days before I entered my retreat, Pope Francis's interview on 60 Minutes had aired, in which he said that a little girl growing up in the church today couldn't dream of one day being ordained a deacon. While a primetime TV interview is by no means official church teaching, his comments still stung. What of the ongoing global synod process that he initiated, which includes a study group that he convened, tasked with looking into the question of women's ordination as permanent deacons? Had he already made up his mind before the consultative process had reached its conclusion? Is this the one issue that synodality doesn't apply to? Furthermore, he denied the well-established history of women's ordination as deacons in the past, even while recognizing that women are indeed serving diaconal functions in the church today without the grace of ordination. What gives? While women have been serving God in the church faithfully for generations, it doesn't seem like we're receiving the same faithfulness and respect from the church. The process of synodality has invited us to reflect and discern about women's roles and equal dignity. At the conclusion of the first phase of the synod a little over a year ago, the document on the continental stage stated that women everywhere are asking the church to be their ally in every part of life. And it's certainly consistent with Catholic social teaching that the church should be an ally to women, who are to varying degrees systematically marginalized, excluded from public life, subjected to sexual violence and all forms of abuse, more likely to live in poverty with its many related vulnerabilities. If we proclaim with the words of our psalm a preferential option for the poor and vulnerable, we certainly must include women under that umbrella. We must believe and live as though God is close to the brokenhearted. And yet, as I entered my retreat, my experience of the church in relationship to my embodiment as a woman was far from one of allyship. And what I realized with that flash of anger as I encountered Jesus by the Sea of Galilee was that the church's failure to be an ally to women had undermined my very ability to see Jesus himself as my ally. It seemed that God wanted to use those 8 days to change that. We need look no further than today's second reading and the many ways it's been deployed by Christians throughout history for reasons women might doubt the church's allyship. Wives should be obedient to their husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of his wife, just as Christ is the head of the church. I've heard plenty of interpretive gymnastics that seek to liberate this text, that it's remarkable that Paul's addressing women at all, that the passage is about mutual submission, that perhaps Paul's speaking to a very specific situation in Ephesus and not to women generally. But perhaps more germane to today's reflection than the original intent of the author is how these lines have been interpreted and used by Christians to harm women. Throughout history and continuing today, these words about wives' obedience have been used to silence women, to keep us in abusive marriages, to justify our oppression. Whatever our efforts to understand and contextualize this passage, it is a text that confronts us. When we reflect on the scriptures, we must ask, do we find that the good news we are proclaiming is in fact good news for everyone, especially the poor and vulnerable? If not, we should perhaps revisit our reflection. When I, a woman, read today's readings, am I to hear God's promises of fidelity as being directed at me? Is God close to my brokenheartedness? What about when it arises from the particularity of my experience as a woman? Does Jesus have the words of eternal life for me as well as for my brothers? Despite a history of undermining itself on the point, our tradition says that yes, I too am saved by God. God is my ally, not in spite of my particular chromosomal composition and society's response to it, but in fact, because of it. I'm reminded of this when I look to the women who followed Jesus. Would they have bankrolled his missions, hosted his parties, washed his feet with their hair, and stayed by his side in moments of great peril if his good news had not pertained to them? Would they have been his ally if he had not been theirs? The fidelity was mutual. Women have been faithful to the church, at times at great cost, even when the rhetoric of the church has been used to push us aside and to harm us. Our fidelity has not always been met with mutuality. When the church's failures to honor my dignity threatened to undermine my sense of God's fidelity to me, as they did on that first day of my retreat, I look to the women who followed and continue to follow Jesus. They, you who are listening now, have been leading me back into trust that the fullness of God's promises pertain to me. We do that for one another. So the good news of today's readings is that Jesus' words of eternal life are for all of us. Some will choose to stay by his side, while others will walk away sad. But his allyship does not discriminate. His invitation is to a relationship of mutual fidelity. As church, we want to reflect and proclaim an invitation to all into a relationship of mutual fidelity with God. Now, the invitation for those of us with teaching and decision-making authority in the church, which in a synodal church that welcomes the co-responsibility of all the baptized is increasingly all of us, the invitation to us is to interrogate our sense of the good news and to listen when someone tells us that our way of sharing it is not good news for them. In the Global Synod, the church has taken the incredible step of beginning to listen to women. The next step is to believe us. I think Jesus would have.